everybody, my name is Dmitry Logunov. I'm curator of entomology collections at the Manchester Museum. Today we are going to talk about migration of butterflies, particularly the scope of British fauna. And for this reason we are having a special guest today, Professor Laurence of the Faculty of Life Sciences, who kindly agreed to answer some of our questions. Yes, and the first thing I'd like to know, or we'd like to know, do butterflies migrate? These small creatures, they are not birds. Do they really migrate?
Well, I could give you a typical academic answer, and that is that in a sense all butterflies, in fact all animals, migrate if you define their movement in that way. We had an academic in Manchester called Robin Baker who was very interested in migration, who defined what he called the lifetime track for an animal. They start somewhere, they end up somewhere else, and what happens in between is often quite closely determined by the type of animals they are and the type of things that they have to do. If you take butterflies, they all have eggs and caterpillars and pupae and adults, and each of those requires something different. It may be all connected with the same plant, it may not be, so that there is a characteristic pattern of movement by the animal, the butterfly, as it moves through from one of these stages to another. If you take British butterflies, for example, there are some which we don't perceive as moving very far. We've got a number of small blue butterflies, for example, which feed on vetches, which are calcium-loving plants. This restricts the butterflies to calcareous areas in the country, and sometimes the animal doesn't have to move very far in order to get the nectar, for example, that it requires as an adult. This is not very far away from the food plant which the larvae are feeding on. On the other hand, if you move a little bit further from that model, you get several brown butterflies in Britain, different species, where the larvae are pretty omnivorous and they eat quite a lot of types of grass, so the range of the animal is much less restricted. It still has to find its own requirements as an adult as well as the larval food plant, and that may determine that although the larvae, for example, feed in open meadows on grass, the adults, during their courtship behaviour, for example, if you take the speckled wood, which is a brown butterfly, during their courtship behaviour they look for bushes in the sunlight where males bask and wait for females to pass, and the whole elaborate procedure takes place there. So that these animals need both a larval food source and also an adult courtship location, and consequently there is movement between them.
Yeah, so this migration, as we are talking about, is related to life cycles. So they have certain requirements, they move from area to area, but they migrate, let's say, short distances. But do they migrate long distances, say, from one continent to another continent? And do you have examples like this in the British fauna?
Yeah, well, I think we usually use the term migration to mean either an awful lot of it going on, or a long distance, or both. The knowledge or awareness of this kind of migration is quite old, in fact. If we go back to, well, in the 19th century, being an island, we can think of the British fauna. It's much more easy than on the continent where borders are land borders. In Britain you can say either it's here or it isn't here, and we're separated by the English Channel. And the first thing in the 19th century that people looked at was insects which were continental insects, which were observed in Britain. And famous ones of those, for example, are the Camberwell Beauty, which during the 19th century was seen in the London area quite often, but it clearly isn't a British butterfly, and these animals had migrated to this country. well-known ones were the hawk moths, not butterflies, but at least one of them. The hummingbird hawk moth is a day-flying insect, and that regularly comes over from the continent to Britain, so we can say that is a migratory species. And along with that, very commonly is a quite definite butterfly, the painted lady, which repeatedly appears in Britain, but is primarily a European species. We'll come on to that a bit later, I think. But taking large numbers, sometimes they are seen in enormous swarms. Darwin, when he went on the voyage of the Beagle in the 1830s, noticed one which he wrote about off the shore of Argentina, quite far out to sea when they were in the boat, which was a tremendous cloud of yellow butterflies, which he thought were the same genus as our clouded yellow. The earliest New World example of this kind comes actually from Columbus himself, who noted something similar in Santo Domingo when he was there. And when you start looking in the records, there are medieval records from Europe and even earlier ones from Japan of white butterflies and yellow butterflies in large swarms passing whatever, passing a boat or passing a location where people were amazed to see the numbers. There's been long-term interest in this in Britain. In the 19th century, entomologists or lepidopterists were very keen on establishing whether insects were British or not. They had a sense of ownership of them if they really were British and not if they were not. So they tried to make a distinction between those which were simply continental and occasionally were blown over here, those which were actually established in this country. And throughout the 19th century there was a great interest in the hawk moths because some of them regularly turned up. There were good years for particular moths and bad years in between related to the weather conditions, and people were very interested in whether in fact they ever bred, whether they ever laid eggs and went through a full cycle in Britain. And some of them, the answer is that some of them do for a few years, and we have some which are definitely British ones and some which are definitely continental and some which occasionally last for a few years in this country and then peter out and then get replaced by a new set of migratory animals. The interest in the 20th century, there was particularly a man called C.B. Williams who became interested actually when he was much earlier in his career, when he was in Guyana and noticed clouds of butterflies moving from one place to another. Why is it, he said, what are they doing? Is it simply that they erupt somewhere and have nowhere else to go, or is this a purposive movement from one place to another? When he came to Britain, he co-opted amateurs to record movements of several species of butterflies in Britain and their first observance at the beginning of the year, and it was found that there were several species. There were 3 species of which we call clouded yellows, genus Coleus, which are regular migrants to this country. The painted lady, which is a migrant which sometimes comes in spectacular numbers. The red admiral, which lives in Britain, it goes through a life cycle in Britain but is augmented by individuals that come from the continent. There were 3 species of white butterfly, the large white, the small white and the green-veined white, which do the same thing. They live here throughout the year, but they get augmented by insects from the continent. So these are the migratory species, and there are, at a guess, there are about a dozen of them which are regular migrants to this country, and have a particular particular position to play in the British fauna.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So you already answered my following question about how many species do migrate to the UK. Okay, Laurence, when we were talking about South American and Central American butterflies, you didn't mention the most famous example of migratory butterfly, the monarch butterfly. Could you tell us a few words about this species, please?
The monarch, yes, it is the most important, the most best studied case of migration in butterflies. We do see it very occasionally in this country. It's a North American animal characteristically, and I think the ones we see are probably blown over sometimes to the British Isles. Whether they've ever bred here, I don't know. They feed on Asclepias, so they're also called the milkweed butterflies sometimes. The plant they feed on, if you break the stems, you get milky fluid out of it, which is poisonous, and the butterfly is poisonous as well. It occurs also, a place I've seen it also is in Madeira, and it gets to Madeira sometimes by the same means, but it does manage to live for a generation or two before dying out again. So it's one of those things which is just on the edge of being able to survive on this side of the Atlantic. On the other side of the Atlantic, it has spectacular migration patterns going from Mexico up to the border with Canada, both on the east and the west of the United States. And this has been followed in great detail, in particular by a man called Lincoln Brower, who has spent much of his lifetime examining the hibernating areas in Mexico and the migration patterns that take place across the United States and Canada. And there is now a very great deal of information about them. This current work that's been going on in Europe is producing a somewhat similar pattern to, it's producing a comparable pattern, let's say, to the study of the monarch in the New World. And it'll be very interesting to compare these two animals, because they both seem to be very, very clearly evolved so that the migration pattern is an intrinsic part of the existence of the species.
What could be the reasons for long migration? Why should they go long distances, not just restricted to their neighboring habitats?
Well, these were the kind of questions which those interested in migration, of course, had in their minds. What was it that was happening? One possibility is simply that the species is so abundant in a place, let's say in France somewhere, you get such large numbers that it's impossible for them to all stay in one place, and therefore they move, and when they move there is no fitness value to that, because they may simply fly out to sea and die, or they may fly to Britain and die and make no further contribution to the species in future generations. But on the other hand, it could be a fitness-related characteristic, which is that one moves from one place to another. In the northern hemisphere, in the southern hemisphere, the reverse is happening, but in the northern hemisphere, from winter into spring and summer, the territory which cold-blooded insects can occupy gradually expands northwards, and there's an advantage in terms of increasing the numbers of individuals in total in a species in spreading northward with the amelioration of the environment as it goes, so that it is apparent that some species do in fact make use of this, and that there is a shall we say, a fitness value to the migration that we see taking place. We have another species I haven't mentioned, which is not a butterfly but a moth, the yellow underwing, large yellow underwing, which we see very commonly in the summer, goes on until September. That is definitely such a species, and it does live throughout the year in this country, but we get very large influxes of continental insects. One of the factors that's involved, which you have to remember when you think about distribution of butterflies, is that they are fairly long-lived. Generation time is fairly long. Sometimes in this country we have 2 generations or even 3 generations a year. Sometimes there's only 1 generation, and it has to fit in with the cycle of seasons. Some insects, some butterflies overwinter as caterpillars, some as pupae, some as adults, and it makes quite a lot of difference to their chance of surviving and what the conditions are like in winter. And it also makes a difference how well adapted that particular species is to surviving in these conditions. Some of these migratory butterflies, I mean, the ones I've mentioned, the red admiral and the painted lady, and also in the same group the comma butterfly and the peacock and the small tortoiseshell, overwinter as adults, and they differ in the extent to which they can they are fitted to overwinter. Some of them will simply hang up somewhere suitable. It might be in holes in trees, or it might be behind curtains in houses, and just stay there for the whole winter. The small tortoiseshell will do that. Others, like the red admiral, tend to come out whenever it gets slightly warm, and they go looking around for food. And if there's no food around, that is a bad thing to do and makes it less likely that they will survive the winter. And the painted lady for a long time was thought simply to come to this country as overspill, if you like, from the continent, fly about here, but not reproduce, and therefore not contribute to future generations. It's recently been found, they certainly don't overwinter here successfully, but what they do instead, and this has recently been shown by some very interesting new work using radar to follow the swarms of butterflies. You can pick out and identify species if you're sufficiently good at using the system. Vast numbers come to this country, and in fact what happens at the end of the year is that they don't simply die, but they fly back southwards, and they fly upwards for a long way into the upper air, and partly they're taken by air current southwards, but they do in fact turn around and fly southwards. So that for the painted lady case, this has been studied in detail recently, and it seems that they come from well south in Africa, through Europe, going progressively north through the seasons, eventually ending up in Britain and Finland and Scandinavia, and at the end of that time they fly back south again, and this cycle goes over thousands of miles and lasts several generations, so that there are succeeding generations going progressively further north in the country, and therefore this is a sort of highly developed fitness-related behaviour pattern, which is absolutely tied up with the idea of long-distance migration.